Happy Hare slicer settings. Everything it takes to set up your slicer. Everything that needs to be done in order to slice properly.
Hadouken!
Okay, we're going to start with the slicer setup by going to the wiki page in Happy Hare. And if you scroll down here to number 6, click on the first link for slicer setup. That'll get you here. So what we're going to do is just going to walk through this. I'm going to explain some things as we go through it. The first thing is going to be how to set up the start G code. Now I use Orca Slicer. I feel like that's pretty common, but this is, pretty common to any slicer. I believe Happy Hare uses Prusa Slicer. If you use any other slicers, it'll be fairly generic to all of them. So the first thing you want to do is hammer down on this start G code. And they give you a nice little template here. Okay, and I am going to show you what I have in Orca Slicer. So let's jump over here to Orca Slicer. And the first thing you want to do is go to your machine, okay? Click on the pencil and notepad, and then come over here to machine G code, all right? And your first one here is going to be the start G code. That's where you're going to basically copy and paste the Happy Hare stuff and put it in here. Now something I like to do on this window is expand this all out. And the reason being is that this is all on one line. And if you crunch it together like this, see, it shows up like it's on 2 lines. Now I guarantee you if you put a return in there, it's going to mess things up. So keep each and every command on its own line. So the first, just like on the Happy Hare, the first one is the start check, and then we're going to put in our own print start macro and whatever you need to pass to it through Clipper. Then we're going to load the initial tool, and then after that you do all the other stuff that you want to do before the print. I have a nozzle cleaning macro. This is my purge line macro. Now this is a Happy Hare command, and it synchronizes the gear stepper to the extruder. I don't think this is necessary anymore. I put it in here because a few iterations back, Happy Hare kind of didn't call it all the time, so I put it in there just to make sure it gets set as we're going forward. And this is passes information to Clipper, so every time I do a layer change, I can figure out how many layers I've got left. Now, on this first line, I want to focus in on that. You'll notice that there are some of these that are in curly braces, and that there are some of these that are surrounded by exclamation points. Now, what that means is the ones in curly braces are ones that the slicer understands. So anytime you have one in curly braces, it needs to come from the slicer's menu. Now, on Orca Slicer, let me close this for a minute. On Orca Slicer, usually if you hover over something, you'll see down there it says parameter name, and then a colon, and then line underscore width. Now if you call that parameter in curly braces, it will pass this value of 0.4 over to Clipper. So that's what the curly braces mean. They come from the slicer. The slicer here says initial tool. Well, it's going to read which first tool you call out when you slice the print, is going to insert that number in, and it's going to pass it through the G code, and then Clipper can see that. Now these reference tools are placeholders that the slicer doesn't understand and Clipper doesn't understand. However, Moonraker does. So when you load a G code into Clipper, Moonraker kind of intercepts the process and it scans that G code looking for different things. That's how you get the thumbnails. Let me switch over here to Notepad where I have some G code that I've exported. Okay, here we see that same information, right? So the initial tool is already input. Now these reference tools and the other exclamations you see, they're still the same, and this is just in the G code output from the slicer. Now Moonraker reads those and changes them, just like up here, all this kind of stuff, it turns into the thumbnails that you see in Clipper Screen or in Mainsail. Moonraker reads through your entire file, and it comes in and it substitutes these placeholders so Clipper and Mainsail and whatnot can understand it. So then if we look at our machine, which I'm going to use Orca Slicer here because it's convenient. If we look at a G code, right, here's one that we're working on right now. And if we click edit file, it'll download it for us. Now this is one that Moonraker's already looked through, and you could see the icon or the picture that is already put in there by Moonraker. It understands that. But if we scroll down here, here's our start block again. Okay. Now if you look here, now reference tools is tool 0. That's all. It's a single color print. Otherwise it would be a comma separated list. The tool colors have been changed over, and it keeps scrolling up on me for some reason. The tool, it's already been substituted in here. Here's the tool temps for each tool, the materials for each tool, and the purge volumes. So Moonraker reads through and it looks at those exclamation point bounded placeholders, and so that's how that kind of works. Now the ones in square brackets are things I believe that Clipper understands, or the slicer imports them as well. So this is how you set up your start code. Now you can do other things in here if you want, but this is just a general template. The important part is to follow the template. Put in your start setup first, your start check next, then your own print start macro. Then you're going to load the initial tool with Happy Hare command, and then after that do whatever else you need to do before the print starts. And that is pretty much it for setting up your start G code. Okay, so the next thing's in G code. It's pretty simple, 2 lines, and let's go over to Orca Slicer and I'll show you what I have. Now I have MMU end, and this parameter eject equals 1. That tells Happy Hare to eject the filament at the end of the print, and it leaves the ERCF or the MMU unit all set up, clean slate, ready to go next time. Your end print is, your user macro that parks the tool head, shuts off heaters, turns off fans, lights, whatever you want to do. Now let's talk about this eject equals 1. That's actually in the MMU macro variables.cfg, and if you scroll down here a ways just a little bit, here's this variable eject tool. If you set this to true, it does the same thing. So in my setup, it's kind of redundant. So you can either set that here or in your end code, either way.
Like, subscribe, with honor.
Okay, the next step then is this after layer change G code. This is to support sequential printing. It updates the height that's stored in there. So when Happy Hare does sequential prints, like each object at a time, it will make sure and jump above all the other objects just to make sure that we're not going to crash with anything. I don't do per object printing. So if we look here in Orca Slicer, I do not have it set up. I don't believe. Okay, here's the layer change G code. I have mine set up as I talked about before. This is just prints out of M117, so you see how many layers are printed versus how many layers there are. Then it updates the current layer. Then so I don't use the after layer change because I don't do a lot of by object printing. And the next one is the tool change G code. This is pretty simple. We just enter this in to the tool change section, and let's take a look at that as well. Okay, yep, I don't have anything other than that. This just tells Happy Hare which is the next tool that's coming up. The next thing we can do is customize some of our start and end macros. This is where you would add in things that you want to have happen before and after the print. For instance, here we have this pre-initialize extension, and that's a G28. These are in MMU macrovers.cfg. You can set up a whole bunch of other ones as well, depending on the state of the printer. So if you look in MMU macrovers.cfg, there's a whole bunch of different things you can do. You can change these out, add in your own macros here. Like I said, there's a whole bunch of extra stuff that you can add in, and that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. So I think one of the things is to just make sure you've got a home in there. Now, if you've got it in your print start macro and you're reasonably sure it's going to home there, you may not need to do this, but if you put it in here, this just guarantees that in an MMU print, you will have it. And I would suggest putting it in there. The next thing it talks about is the error dialog. You can show these pop-ups in mainsail and clipper screen by using MMU parameters.cfg and switching on show error dialog to 1. If you're writing your own macros and they are lengthy and have a lot of steps and all that, you might want to shut this off, because if something happens during one of those macros, it will lock everything up. You can't get rid of this screen. You can't do anything with it until that macro completes. And if the macro errors, you're kind of stuck in a loop. So my suggestion is, if you're going to use auxiliary macros, like a print start macro that's long and huge and calls up a whole bunch of different functions, take and put each one of those functions in its own macro and call the macros in sequence instead of one huge macro. That way, if something goes wrong, you're not stuck looking at this because a macro didn't complete. Now that kind of does all that we need to do with the setup of our start and end macros and some customization. So after that, we're going to go on to tool change movement. Now the tool change movement is really well laid out. Mogi did a heck of a job at making some really nice looking diagrams and explaining which variables affect which positions, and it goes through and talks about how to make it move through this whole thing. You can see down here at the bottom there's even more. I'm not going to go through all of that. It's a good read though, so I would suggest doing that. This way you can tune how it moves, where it goes, and all that when it's doing the tool changes. The important part that I want to cover today is this section, the role of the slicer. Now we have to turn off everything in Orca Slicer, everything, or any slicer, not just Orca Slicer. We have to make sure that the slicer does not pass any tool changes over to Happy Hare. You can use the slicer to do the tool changes and such, but it's just a whole lot easier to just run everything through Happy Hare instead of trying to get them to talk back and forth. I've tried it before. I didn't have a whole lot of luck. it wasn't a fun experience for me anyways. Now, if you really want to get your hands dirty and configure a whole bunch of stuff custom, you can do that by letting the slicer handle the tool changes and tip forming and all that. But I would suggest, especially if you're just new, let Happy Hare take care of it. So what we want to do is we want to turn off all the variables regarding to tool changes. The only thing we want the slicer to output is say the T4 for the next tool. That's all we want to see come out of there. So this is all in Prusa Slicer, but they're actually pretty similar in Orca Slicer. So let's go have a look at that. And this one in the multi-material setup in the machine settings, okay, this is, all these need to be 0 except for the cooling tube length. Now there's a reason, and I don't recall what it is, but if you put a 0 in there, it kind of confuses the slicer and it starts adding in some stuff we don't want. So just make it a small number. 0.01 or 0.01 is, 0.001 is fine. Just a small number. And Happy Hare, we input our own variables in there, and that's part of the tool head setup. I did that in another video. I'll try and post a link. It's important that this be a small non-zero number. Another thing you want to do is turn on this purge in Prime Tower. This makes Orca Slicer put a purge tower in there. Now, if you're using Blobifier, I don't believe you need this, but maybe you do. I'm not sure. I haven't used Blobifier. If you have questions about that, then Drowan on GitHub is a good person to ask. This enable ramming, you want to turn that off. I'm not convinced that it does anything, but let's have it turned off anyway. Of course, you want to select your single extruder multi-material and leave the manual tool change off. Let's go back to Happy Hare. So that kind of covers these. The rest of these, we want to turn everything off, and let's go look again at Orca Slicer. And I believe those are in the filament and multi-material. Yes, here we go. So this minimal purge on Wipe Tower is the minimum it's going to purge regardless of what the filament matrix is, the flushing volumes. Well, the thing I don't know is this in lieu of, say, if the flushing volumes say we only want 5, and is it going to substitute in 10? Or is it going to add this to everything? So if it says 5, we get 15. I'm not real sure on that. I've been using 10. It seems to work okay for me. The next things are everything in here needs to be zeros, okay? Except for these two, filament load time and unload time. Now, all these are numbers that the slicer uses to calculate how long the tool change takes. And as you go through, it tells you in this output your average tool change time, and here you can see mine's 30.6. Our loading time is going to be 4.96 plus 26.1 plus 1.91. You can do that math in your head, right? These numbers here, you can use those and put those back into these numbers here if you want. That'll help tune your calculation of the print time for your multi-material prints through the slicer. Now, here's ramming settings. I know we turned that off in the machine, but you still need to go in and set that time to 0. Yeah, I think it starts at 2.5, so you can see it pushes a whole lot of filament out there. So just, and you can adjust these all you want, and you can't make it go to 0. See here it says 20 cubic millimeters of filament are going to be rammed. The only way I found is to set these to 0. And you have to do it on every single filament you put in. Every one of them. If you get a new filament you have to put in there and set it up, you have to go and set this to 0. At least when I was setting it up, that filament ramming in the machine tab didn't work. It didn't stop it. So set these all to 0. That takes care of these variables. This extra length on restart right here in Orca Slicer is in the printer settings up here again, and then over in the extruder clear down at the bottom. These two here, these need to be zeros as well. So it's important to set those, otherwise you'll get big blobs on your purge tower. The next one is enable the wipe tower, and we already talked about that. That is in the multi-material right here, so make sure that is enabled. Now if you use a super slicer, it has skinny dipping, and you'll want to turn that off. Now Happy Hare has that option in there. You can run it through Happy Hare, but be sure and turn that off, otherwise you get some really huge blobs on your purge tower. And here it talks about if you want to use a custom purge system, i.e. the blobifier, it does say to go ahead and turn off the wipe tower option. So it's pretty well done talking about the setups in the slicer, but this talks about, you know, how does Happy Hare control everything. One thing that is very important is this, and that is set in MMU parameters.cfg. If you scroll down to tip forming, here it is, form tip standalone. You want to set that to 1. That makes sure that Happy Hare is the one doing all the work. And as it says here, be sure and turn off all the slicer options. And that forces Happy Hare to take over and run all the MMU stuff for the slicer option. The last part of section 6 is the tip forming and purging. You'll have to decide whether or not you want to install a cutter, and there's a couple different cutters available. There's a tool head cutter, there's an encoder cutter, or you can get rid of them altogether and use tip forming. Tip forming is not easy. It takes a lot of time. It's frustrating. You will clog your tool head a million times while you're doing this test. I may go ahead and do a video on that. I've done a little bit of this and I'm getting better at it. By no means am I perfect, but you want to make sure and have all these tips kind of look like that with no big stringy things coming off of them. If you get strings in there, you're going to clog things up. So you'll have to go through it. This talks about how to tune it, and this is a really good way to use it. I would suggest though currently that you don't use this MMU load extruder only. I would just grab the filament and jam it in there by hand, and the reason is when you test form tip, it doesn't seem to, right now anyway, it doesn't seem to reset the fact that, hey, there's no filament in the extruder, and then when you run this one again, it'll say, oh, Happy Hare thinks there's still filament in the extruder, and therefore this command won't run. So just shove it in there by hand and go through this. I bet I've done 3 meters of filament and well over 200 attempts, and I'm barely getting to where these look like in the picture. Like I say, I'm nowhere proficient about it, but I think I've kind of got an idea of some of the things that need to go on, so I may do a video of that here in the future. Here we talk about purge volumes, and if we go to Orca Slicer, I'll show you where that's at in Orca Slicer. If we look up here right by filament, there's flushing volumes. Now in Orca Slicer, you can calculate that. It kind of depends on your filament and what type and all that. It varies from manufacturer to manufacturer, but it gets pretty close. So what we do is we have the from side here and the to side. So if we're going to change from, let's say, black filament over here to this number 4, which is transparent on my machine, you can see it's going to purge 321 cubic millimeters of filament. That's quite a bit, but it makes sense because black's got a whole lot of pigment in it and transparent doesn't have any. But on the other hand, if we go from transparent to black, we only need 45. That's because there's such a heavy amount of filament, or excuse me, such a heavy amount of pigment in the black as compared to transparent. Now this multiplier down here, you can adjust that, and that's the easiest way, is to just say, well, we've got too big of a purge block, everything's printing clean, let's go to 0.4 or 40%, okay, and then hit recalculate, and it's going to drop those values a bit. I've heard people using as little as 25%. I have found that 40 to 60% is about right, depending. If you're absolutely absolutely want to get rid of as much waste as possible, you can get it close here and then come in and say, hey, that's a little too much. Let's drop it down to 150. As long as you don't hit recalculate, it'll stay there. But if you hit recalculate, it goes back. It's pretty easy just to sit in here and kind of tweak these numbers. And as you get more and more tool changes, you'll get homed in closer on that. So that's how it's done in Orca Slicer. Purging on the wipe tower. If you enable that, you'll purge everything in the wipe tower. There's some options in Orca Slicer to purge on the infill, and I have never got that to work. I don't mess with it a lot. The ooze reduction, a lot of this is going to be covered by the tool head parameter tuning that I did in the other video. It'll measure all that for you, and it'll get pretty close. But here you go, you can see, you can test during the print whether you want ooze reduction or not. Once you figure it out, you need to put the final result in there. So you can put the number in from 0 to whatever and start tuning that in print. And here it gives a nice little graphic on, you know, what it should look like. If there's too much space in here, it's not good. Little bit's okay. Then we start getting blobs in there between the colors. It does talk about the no wipe tower option and how to handle it for things like blob of fire. It talks about tip cutting, how to tune that. One of the things that I found is your retraction and pushback are pretty important for waste elimination. You can tune your retraction by backing off your depressor so the blade doesn't cut all the way through, and then do a tool head swap and then look at the mark that's left on your filament versus how much filament's left, and you can start tuning in to where you can only cut off just the bare, like maybe 1 or 2 millimeters left. And then your pushback, you want to make sure that it pushes back into the melt pool. You don't want to leave that cutoff tip sitting up there in the cooling tower part, otherwise it'll kind of lock up and freeze there. So you want to push it back clear down into the melt pool to keep that thing pretty liquid until the next pit of filament comes along. Now in an EREC, you can tune that as how much it cuts off, and it just throws it across the shop or whatever, you know, gives your cat something to chase. So you can tune that on how much you want to do there. So you'd want to see the ERAC documentation for that. And, you know, that pretty well sums up everything. I hope that helps you figure out, you know, what you need to do in the slicer and get your tool changes working well. This ties in pretty close with the tool head tuning that I made a video on before. So you want to kind of bounce back and forth between these two and work on getting everything set up so it works really slick. And if you get to this point with your MMU, you'll notice down here that you get this nice little thing that says, hey, now you're ready to print.
Flawless victory.
And that's a good feeling, isn't it? That really makes it worth all the, and the next one's going to be the blobbing and stringing, which is that other video I went through. At this point, I think I'm probably going to end the ERCF tutorials because we've gone through everything in all these videos, from setting up Happy Hare, getting it installed, down through the essential calibration, your hardware, getting it all set up and working, your physical calibration, setting up all the parameters that relate to the physical nature of the ERCF. The basic operation I didn't go through because that's more of a reading exercise, just kind of instructs you on how things work and what to do. That would not make a good video. I'm sorry guys, I know I'm entertaining and all, but I just don't think I could make this into a good video. And we finally set up the slicer and everything. So you should be ready to start printing and then go on through your tuning. So I think this is probably going to be my last tutorial on ERCF. Unless you guys would like to have something else, I think I might do a tip forming, but I'm not sure.
That's all you need to know about slicer settings from the Dad Ninja.
Hadouken!